Could you survive weeks without seeing another soul outside your community? What if your only connection to the world was a single dangerous path, impassable for months? How did women devoted to God endure such extreme isolation in medieval Europe? Number 1. The Convent of the Plague's Shadow. Imagine a convent not isolated by mountains or seas, but by something far more terrifying. Fear itself. Convent of the Plague's Shadow, nestled on a windswept barren plain in what is now central France, was initially founded in the late 12th century as a modest retreat for sisters seeking quiet devotion. Its location, while somewhat remote, was not inherently cut off from the world. Small villages dotted the landscape within a day's ride, and merchants occasionally passed on their way to larger towns. The plains offered little natural defense or beauty, just open space and endless sky. The sisters lived a simple life, tending to their small gardens, caring for a few sheep, and weaving cloth for sale. Their isolation was a choice, a preference for solitude over the bustle of urban life. But it was not absolute. Then came the year 1348. The Black Death swept across Europe, a relentless tide of sickness and death that spared few regions. As the plague crept closer to the convent, rumors became terrifying realities. Villages that had once sent donations or sought spiritual counsel from the sisters now began to disappear, their populations decimated. The few travelers who still dared to traverse the plains spoke of carts laden with bodies, of homes left empty, of the very air seeming to carry the stench of death. Convent, once merely quiet, transformed into a fortress of fear. Not walls of stone, but invisible barriers of terror sealed it off. No one dared approach. The sisters themselves were not immune. Despite their prayers and precautions, the sickness found its way in, carried perhaps on the clothing of a desperate refugee seeking shelter, or on the breath of a dying bird. Chronicles of Sister Beatrice, one of the few surviving personal accounts from that period, describe the horrifying progression. The first sister to fall ill was Sister Genevieve, her skin dark, her voice a ragged whisper. We tended her with what knowledge we possessed, but the physician from the nearest town, a day's journey, had long since ceased his visits. This entry, dated to the late spring of 1348, paints a grim picture. Convent infirmary, usually reserved for ailments of old age or minor injuries, became a place of dread. As the plague intensified, the convent's isolation became absolute. Path leading to its gates, once merely quiet, grew over with weeds. No cart tracks disturbed the dust. The sound of distant church bells ceased. The sisters were left utterly alone, not just physically, but spiritually. The vital connections to the wider church hierarchy, to other convents, to the very communities they served, were severed. There were no new novices, no visiting priests to offer Mass, no messengers to carry news or requests. Their world shrank to the confines of their walls, and even within those walls, it continued to shrink as their numbers dwindled. The daily routines, usually a source of comfort and order, became a desperate struggle for survival. Food supplies, usually replenished by local markets or donations, grew dangerously low. The gardens, once tended with care, saw fewer hands working the soil. The sheep left largely untended, scattered, or fell victim to wild animals. Water from their well, though plentiful, felt heavy with the weight of despair. The sisters were forced to become entirely self-sufficient in a way they had never anticipated, relying on their own ingenuity for everything, from finding firewood to treating the sick. The psychological toll was immense. Constant threat of contagion, the grief of losing sisters day after day, the crushing silence from the outside world, all contributed to an atmosphere of profound despair. Sister Beatrice's chronicle further reveals this. Each morning we count the empty places at prayer. Each night we pray that no more will be taken before the dawn. The fear is a cold hand constant upon our hearts. We are forgotten by the world, remembered only by God, we hope. This poignant reflection from 1349 encapsulates the unique horror of their isolation. They were not just cut off geographically, they were deliberately avoided, seen as a place of death, a source of contamination. Their only contact with the outside world became a negative one. The occasional sight of smoke from a distant burning village, or the eerie silence where once the sounds of human activity had carried on the wind. The plague pit, just beyond their walls, grew steadily, a stark monument to their suffering. They were living in a forced quarantine, a silent, macabre experiment in extreme separation. No one came for help. No one came to offer comfort. And no one came to check if they still existed. Convent and its remaining inhabitants truly became a shadow on the plain, a place the world had decided to forget. The convent's ultimate fate remains uncertain in many historical records. Some later documents, from decades after the plague had receded, show the property listed as abandoned or ruined, suggesting the community did not recover. Others suggest a few survivors might have eventually joined another, larger community. What is clear, however, is that for a crucial period during the height of the Black Death, the Convent of the Plague's Shadow experienced an isolation of a unique and horrifying kind, an isolation imposed not by nature's mighty hand, but by humanity's primal fear. Their experience stands as a stark reminder that isolation can be a social construct, as impenetrable as any mountain range or stormy sea. Number 2. The Convent of the Scorched Earth. The Aegean Sea, sparkling under a brilliant sun, seems an unlikely place for profound isolation, yet it holds secrets. Among its countless islands, one particularly stark and desolate volcanic peak, known in local lore as Pyra, the Fire Island, was home to the Convent of the Scorched Earth. Founded in the late 9th century by a small group of Byzantine nuns fleeing political upheaval on the mainland. Their decision to settle on Pyra was born of desperation and a desire for absolute separation from worldly affairs. The island offered little beyond rock, sparse brush, and the constant ominous presence of a simmering volcano. Their convent, a cluster of stone buildings clinging to the lower slopes of the dormant peak, was visible from the sea as little more than a smudge against the dark rock. Its isolation was multi-layered. Firstly, geographical. Pyra was not on any major shipping lane. Vessels traversing the Aegean preferred the more fertile, populated islands. Landing on Pyra was treacherous, with sharp rocks and unpredictable currents, making it dangerous even in calm weather. There was no natural harbor, just a few precarious coves where a small boat might be dragged ashore. The journey from the nearest populated island could take a full day of arduous sailing, and frequently, weeks would pass without a single ship appearing on the horizon. Secondly, geological. The island itself was a living, breathing testament to the Earth's raw power. The soil was volcanic ash and pumice, making agriculture a constant, disheartening struggle. Water was scarce, collected in cisterns during the infrequent rains, often tainted by volcanic minerals. The very ground beneath their feet was unstable. Earthquakes were a regular occurrence, ranging from gentle tremors that rattled their icons to violent shakes that sent stones tumbling from their walls. Constant threat of eruption hung over them like a shroud. Chronicles of Sister Helena, a 12th century abbess, detail the fear. The earth groans beneath us, and smoke rises from the peak, a reminder of the fire that sleeps but never dies. Our prayers are often mingled with the tremor of the ground. This account, found in the archives of a distant monastery on Mount Athos, paints a vivid picture of their precarious existence. Life at the Convent of the Scorched Earth was dictated by the harsh realities of their environment. They subsisted largely on what little they could grow in their painstakingly cultivated terraced gardens, a few hardy grapes, some onions and olives, supplemented by whatever fish could be caught by the few fishermen who braved the island shores. Any necessities not produced on the island, such as parchment, oil for lamps, or simple tools, had to be bartered for with the occasional passing merchant ship, a transaction that could take months to arrange and often involve disproportionate sacrifices. Terms were always on the merchant's side, knowing the nuns had no other recourse. Communication with the outside world was almost non-existent. A letter sent to the Patriarch in Constantinople might take a year or more to receive a reply, if one ever came. News of political shifts, theological debates, or even major historical events often reached them months or years after the fact, distorted by rumor and speculation, or simply never arrived at all. Their world was entirely self-contained, its rhythms dictated by the sun, the sea, and the unpredictable temper of the volcano. Their spiritual life, intense and fervent, was perhaps their greatest solace and defense against the crushing loneliness and fear. The challenges were numerous. Beyond the ever-present threat of eruptions and earthquakes, there was the constant struggle for fresh water. Long droughts meant rationing, and the sisters often suffered from dehydration. Medical care was rudimentary at best. Severe illnesses or injuries often proved fatal due to the lack of skilled healers or proper medicines. A record from the bishopric of Naxos, dated 1150, mentions a plea from the convent for a skilled physician, for our sisters perish from the agues of the island, illustrating their desperate need and remoteness. The unique isolation of the convent of the Scorched Earth also fostered a peculiar resilience. The sisters developed a deep understanding of their harsh environment, learning to read the subtle signs of the volcano, to predict shifts in the wind that brought welcome rain, and to identify the safest places to shelter during tremors. Their prayers often included fervent pleas for stable ground and calm seas, reflecting their constant struggle. Their very existence was a testament to unwavering faith in the face of overwhelming natural forces. Convent survived for centuries, a small beacon of human endurance and spiritual devotion on a landscape that seemed to actively resist human habitation. It was a place where the earth itself was a constant, powerful reminder of humanity's smallness and a test of faith beyond the ordinary. Number 3. The Convent of the Hanging Sky. Clinging to the sheer, dizzying face of a towering limestone cliff in the Dolomites, a region now part of northern Italy, stood the Convent of the Hanging Sky. This extraordinary settlement was not merely built in the mountains, it was part of the mountain, a series of carved-out chambers and small stone-built additions that seemed to defy gravity. Its founding in the early 11th century by a reclusive order of Benedictine nuns was a deliberate choice for ultimate asceticism and separation from the world. The sisters here sought not just solitude, but an existence on the very edge of the possible. The isolation of the Convent of the Hanging Sky was breathtakingly absolute. The nearest valley floor was over 1,000 feet below, a verdant ribbon of farmland that seemed impossibly distant. There was no road, no discernible path leading directly to the convent. Access was an engineering marvel and a test of nerve. Supplies and the rare new novice had to be hauled up the cliff face by a system of ropes and pulleys, or by navigating a perilous, barely there path that involved scrambling over loose rock and scaling rickety wooden ladders lashed to the cliff. One misplaced step meant certain death. A visitor's account from a wandering friar in 1280, recorded in the annals of the Trent bishopric, described the approach. The ascent was an act of faith, each step a prayer. The convent seemed to hang between heaven and earth, a place for angels, not mortals. Life inside the convent was a triumph of adaptation. Space was incredibly limited. Cells were often little more than niches carved into the rock, just large enough for a cot and a small prayer desk. The chapel, surprisingly spacious for its location, offered a vast, unobstructed view of the sky and the distant peaks, a view that both inspired awe and emphasized their isolation. There was no possibility of agriculture. The few scraps of soil on ledges were used for hardy herbs. Water was collected from glacial meltwater seeping through the rock, or painstakingly hauled up in barrels from a spring far below. Every single item from a candle to a loaf of bread represented an enormous effort to acquire. The daily routine was interwoven with the dangers and challenges of their unique home. The ringing of the morning bell might be accompanied by the distant rumble of a rockfall. Prayers for deliverance from temptation often merged with prayers for safety from the mountain's unpredictable temperament. The constant threat of rock slides, sudden blizzards that could plaster the cliff face with snow and ice, or the failure of their primitive hauling equipment was ever present. Medical aid was non-existent. A broken bone, a severe illness, or a simple fall could be a death sentence. Communication with the outside world was almost non-existent. Messages were rare, carried by the occasional brave mountaineer or daring friar who risked the ascent. Years could pass without any news from the valleys below. The sisters lived in a self-imposed vacuum, their only connection to the world being the vast open sky before them and the deep echoing silence of the mountains. They relied entirely on their own community for support, for comfort, and for spiritual sustenance. The psychological effects of such extreme exposure and isolation were profound. Constant awareness of the abyss below, the limited physical space, and the lack of external stimuli honed their inner lives to a razor's edge. Their dreams were said to be filled with the wind in the high places. Despite the hardships, the convent of the hanging sky endured for centuries, a testament to the indomitable spirit of its inhabitants. Became a legend in the region, a place whispered about with reverence and awe. Local shepherds and villagers would sometimes see the faint glow of their lamps at night, tiny pinpricks of light suspended against the vast darkness of the cliff, a reminder of the extraordinary devotion being practiced high above them. Convent was not merely a building, it was an act of unwavering faith, a permanent vigil against the very forces of nature, a place where the veil between heaven and earth felt impossibly thin. Its history is a compelling narrative of human will pushing the boundaries of survival and spiritual yearning in one of the most improbable locations imaginable. Number 4. The Convent of the Midnight Sun. Far beyond the reaches of common medieval maps, nestled deep within the icy embrace of what is now northern Scandinavia, stood the Convent of the Midnight Sun. Founded by a small group of zealous Saxon nuns in the late 10th century who felt the pull of the utter wilderness, this convent represented an extreme form of isolation, dictated less by geography and more by the very climate and celestial cycles. The landscape was vast, unforgiving, and sparsely populated, dominated by pine forests, frozen lakes, and immense snow-covered plains for much of the year. Their isolation was defined by extremes. For several months in winter, the sun never fully rose, plunging the convent into an unending twilight, often accompanied by the mesmerizing but eerie glow of the aurora borealis. The cold was bone-chilling, with temperatures plummeting far below freezing, making travel outside the immediate vicinity almost impossible. In stark contrast, summer brought weeks of continuous daylight where the sun merely skimmed the horizon at night, disorienting the natural rhythms of life. The nearest established settlement of any size was a week's arduous journey by sledge in winter, or by boat along the coast in summer, a journey fraught with dangers from wild animals and treacherous terrain. Life at the Convent of the Midnight Sun was a continuous battle against the elements. Survival depended on incredible resilience and ingenuity. They relied heavily on hunting and fishing, often sending out teams of sisters bundled in furs to check traps or ice fish in frozen lakes. Agriculture was minimal. Only the hardiest root vegetables could survive the short, intense summer growing season, and even those were vulnerable to early frosts. Their diet was heavily reliant on preserved meats and fish, fermented berries, and a meager supply of imported grains. Warmth was paramount, consuming vast amounts of timber from the surrounding forests, a task that required constant, back-breaking labor. The daily routine revolved around adapting to the light cycles. During the long winter darkness, spiritual devotion became even more intense, with sisters spending extended hours in prayer, illuminated by flickering whale oil lamps. The psychological effects of perpetual darkness were profound, often leading to a deep contemplative state, but also testing the limits of endurance. The summer's endless daylight, while offering reprieve from the cold, brought its own challenges, disrupting sleep and creating a sense of timelessness. Records from a visiting cleric, Father Einar, who managed to reach the convent in 1320 after a perilous journey, stated, "Their faces are pale from the long night, but their eyes shine with a fierce devotion. They are truly God's guardians in the frozen wastes." This observation, found in the Uppsala Cathedral archives, captures the spirit of the sisters. Communication with the outside world was almost non-existent. Supply boat might visit once a year, bringing essential goods like salt, metal, tools, or parchment, but often winter storms would prevent its arrival, leaving the sisters entirely to their own devices. News from the south was rare and outdated, making the convent a true island in an ocean of ice and darkness. Political turmoils and theological debates of the wider church seemed distant, almost irrelevant in the face of their daily struggle for survival. Challenges were numerous. Frostbite was a constant threat, and many sisters lost fingers or toes. Scurvy, due to the lack of fresh vegetables, was a common ailment. Encounters with wolves, bears, and other wild animals were not uncommon. Medical aid was non-existent. The sisters relied on traditional remedies and their own fortitude. The sheer physical demands of their existence meant that only the most robust and determined women could endure life at the Convent of the Midnight Sun. Despite these hardships, the convent persisted for centuries, a stark testament to the human capacity for endurance and unwavering faith. It became a legendary place among the scattered indigenous peoples and Norse settlers of the region, a beacon of Christian faith in a land where nature reigned supreme. The Sisters of the Midnight Sun were not just isolated. They existed in a realm where the fundamental rhythms of the earth itself imposed a unique and profound separation from the rest of the world. Their story is one of profound adaptation, resilience, and a deep spiritual connection forged in the crucible of extreme isolation. Number 5. The Convent of the Whispering Marshes. Deep within the sprawling, waterlogged expanse of the English fenlands, a landscape of mist, reed beds, and winding waterways, stood the Convent of the Whispering Marshes. Founded in the late 10th century by a small group of nuns seeking refuge from the Danish invasions, this community found itself isolated not by towering mountains or vast oceans, but by the very ground beneath their feet. The fens were a treacherous, labyrinthine environment, a place where land and water blurred and solid ground was a rare commodity. The isolation of the Convent of the Whispering Marshes was profound and insidious. Reaching it required navigating a complex network of shallow, reed-choked channels by flat-bottomed boat, or traversing narrow, muddy causeways that often disappeared under rising tides or winter floods. The landscape was an almost impenetrable maze, where dense fog could descend without warning, disorienting even the most experienced local. Contemporary accounts from the 12th century, such as a land dispute record from Ely Abbey, refer to the area as the Bog of Sighs, hinting at its unforgiving nature and the difficulty of passage. There were no roads, no clear paths. Every journey was an expedition. Life at the convent was inextricably linked to the marshland, The sisters were masters of their watery environment. They learned to fish for eels, a staple of their diet, and to harvest reeds for thatch and basket weaving. Their buildings, constructed on carefully chosen slightly raised islands of drier ground, were constantly battling damp and subsidence. Drinking water was a particular challenge, as the marsh water was often brackish or stagnant. They relied on carefully dug wells that tapped into deeper, purer aquifers. Their diet, though sufficient, was monotonous, heavily dependent on fish, fowl, and a few hardy root vegetables that could tolerate the damp soil. The daily routine was shaped by the unique demands of the fenlands. Morning prayers might be accompanied by the haunting calls of marsh birds or the croak of 1,000 frogs. Travel for supplies or to attend to spiritual duties in nearby, though still distant, communities was a rare, arduous undertaking. A journey to a market town that might take a day by road elsewhere could easily consume 3 days of perilous navigation through the fens. The sisters became adept boat handlers, their skiffs their primary mode of transport. Challenges faced by the Convent of the Whispering Marshes were numerous and constant. Disease was a pervasive threat, particularly ague or malaria, which was endemic to marshy regions. Fevers and chills were a constant companion, debilitating many of the sisters and often proving fatal. Petition from the abbess to the Bishop of Norwich in 1250, recorded in the diocesan archives, requests medicinal herbs and tinctures against the wasting fever that takes our sisters, highlighting their desperate need for external help. Beyond illness, there was the ever-present danger of getting lost in the dense fog, of falling into a hidden bog, or of their fragile causeways collapsing. Wild animals, particularly large predatory birds and wild boar, also posed a threat. Communication with the outside world was sparse. Letters were carried by special messenger, often taking weeks to reach their destination. News arrived, slowly distorted by the remoteness and the isolation of their setting. Convent existed in a world apart, its rhythms governed by the tides, the mists, and the unique ecology of the wetlands. Their solitude, however, was not always peaceful. The fens were also a haven for outlaws and renegades, making occasional encounters with unsavory characters a terrifying possibility. Despite the hardships, the Convent of the Whispering Marshes endured for centuries, a testament to the resilience of its inhabitants and their deep connection to their unusual home. Their prayers often included pleas for dry ground and clear skies, a direct reflection of their daily struggles. They were a community defined by their watery isolation. A small island of faith in a vast whispering wilderness of reeds and mist, where the line between land and water and between safety and peril was always thin. Their story brooks how isolation can be imposed not by grand geographical features, but by the subtle yet formidable nature of a unique environment. Number 6. The Convent of the Hidden Fjord. Tucked away at the absolute end of a long, narrow, and often ice-bound fjord in what is now western Norway, lay the Convent of the Hidden Fjord. Founded in the late 11th century by a small band of Norse women seeking a life of profound seclusion and spiritual devotion, this convent represented an extreme example of geographical isolation. The fjord itself, a deep glacial cut into the formidable Norwegian mountains, was their only reliable pathway to the outside world, and it was a path fraught with danger and often impassable. The isolation of the Convent of the Hidden Fjord was defined by its physical setting. On either side, sheer granite cliffs, thousands of feet high, plunged directly into the deep, dark waters of the fjord. There were no overland routes. The mountains behind the convent were a chaotic jumble of jagged peaks, glaciers, and impassable passes, snowbound for 9 months of the year. During winter, the fjord itself would often freeze solid for weeks or months, creating a vast, desolate expanse of ice that cut off all sea-based travel. Even in summer, The journey down the fjord to the open sea and then to any semblance of a town could take days, battling winds, currents, and sudden squalls. The very name of the fjord in some ancient maps, Dovfjorden or Dead Fjord, found in a Bergen trade ledger from 1250, hints at its desolate nature. Life at the convent of the hidden fjord was shaped by this profound remoteness. They were almost entirely self-sufficient. Fishing from the fjord provided their primary source of sustenance. Small, laboriously cleared plots of land on the few flat areas near the convent were coaxed into yielding hardy root vegetables and some hay for their few goats. Timber from the sparse forests clinging to the lower slopes was vital for heating and building, a constant struggle against the cold. Their diet was simple and often monotonous, heavily reliant on dried fish and stored provisions. The daily routine was one of constant vigilance against the elements. The sound of cracking ice in winter or the roar of an avalanche from the cliffs in spring were everyday occurrences. Communication with the outside world was minimal. A supply ship, if one could be persuaded to make the arduous journey, might arrive once or twice a year bringing essential goods like salt, grain, or tools. Often, these ships would be delayed or turned back due to storms or ice, leaving the sisters to face the long dark winters with whatever they had managed to stockpile. News from the outside world, if it arrived at all, was months old and often irrelevant to their immediate concerns of survival. The challenges were severe. The extreme cold of winter meant constant risk of frostbite and hypothermia. Avalanche danger was ever present, sometimes burying parts of the convent or cutting them off completely. The treacherous nature of the fjord meant that any journey by boat was fraught with peril, and shipwreck was a constant fear. Medical aid was non-existent. Sisters relied on folk remedies and their own fortitude to battle illnesses and injuries. A record from a rare visit by a bishop's envoy in 1370 describes the sisters as hardened by the rock and the sea, their faces etched with the struggles of this remote existence, a stark image of their daily lives. The isolation also fostered an incredibly close-knit community. With no one else to rely on, the sisters depended entirely on each other for physical labor, emotional support, and spiritual fellowship. Their prayers were often for safe passage, for bountiful fishing, and for protection from the harsh elements, reflecting their immediate daily struggles. Profound quiet of the fjord, broken only by the cry of gulls or the rush of water, became a part of their spiritual landscape, a constant invitation to contemplation. Despite the crushing challenges, the convent of the hidden fjord endured for centuries, a remote beacon of faith in an incredibly hostile environment. It stands as a powerful example of human determination to live a life of spiritual devotion, even when confronted by the most formidable natural barriers. Their story highlights how geographical features can impose an almost absolute isolation, shaping every aspect of a community's existence and fostering a unique resilience. Number 7. The Convent of the Desert Rose. On the sun-baked, parched fringes of what is now southern Spain, bordering the vast semi-arid lands of Al-Andalus, stood the Convent of the Desert Rose. Founded in the late 10th century by a small group of Mozarabic nuns, Christians living under Muslim rule, seeking a secure place to practice their faith away from the complex political landscape of the Reconquista. Their choice of location was a deliberate act of seeking refuge, which inadvertently led to extreme isolation. The region was a stark transition zone between fertile coastal plains and expansive arid landscapes, making travel difficult and life precarious. The isolation of the Convent of the Desert Rose was defined by its unforgiving environment and the volatile political climate. Convent lay many days' journey from any major Christian town, across plains that offered little shelter from the intense sun and even less water. The few tracks that traversed the region were often nothing more than dusty paths, easily lost in the shifting sands. Beyond the environmental challenges, the convent sat precariously on the historical frontier between Christian and Muslim territories, making it vulnerable to raids from both sides, particularly from nomadic Berber tribes or renegade Christian bandits who saw easy targets in isolated communities. This constant threat meant that few dared to travel to or from the convent, solidifying its separation. A Moorish traveler's account from 1180, translated much later, describes the convent as a solitary stone in the vastness shunned by man and embraced by the sun. Life at the Convent of the Desert Rose was a testament to resilience and meticulous planning. Water was the most precious commodity. The sisters relied on a deep well, painstakingly dug and maintained, and a series of cisterns to capture the infrequent but often violent rainfalls. Agriculture was limited to drought-resistant crops like olives and figs, and small, intensely irrigated patches for herbs. Their diet was Spartan, supplemented by what little they could trade for with the rare brave merchant who ventured near their walls, often at exorbitant prices. Convent itself was built like a small fortress, with thick stone walls and few windows, a necessary defense against the ever-present threat of raiding parties. The daily routine was structured around resource conservation and defense. Every drop of water was cherished. The ringing of the morning bell might be interrupted by the distant dust cloud of riders, sending the sisters scrambling to secure the gates. Communication with the outside world was sporadic and dangerous. Letters sent to bishops or distant family members might take months to arrive, if they ever did, carried by courageous or desperate individuals. News from the wider world was always old, filtered through many unreliable sources, and often distorted. The sisters lived in a self-contained world, their spiritual life intensified by their constant vulnerability and reliance on divine protection. The challenges were numerous. Prolonged droughts could mean critical water shortages, forcing the sisters to pray for rain with desperate fervor. Intense heat stroke was a constant risk during the long summers. The threat of banditry or raids meant living in a perpetual state of alert, with their meager defenses always ready. Medical care was primitive. Illnesses exacerbated by poor diet or exposure to the elements were often fatal. A document from the See of Toledo dated 1290 mentions a request from the abbess for a small guard of faithful men to protect our sisters from the many dangers of the plain, indicating their constant peril. Despite the hardships and dangers, the Convent of the Desert Rose endured for centuries, a testament to the unwavering faith and fortitude of its inhabitants. It became a symbol of steadfast Christian presence in a contested land, surviving through sheer determination and the grace of God. Isolation, enforced by both nature's aridity and humanity's conflict, shaped a community of women whose lives were defined by a profound reliance on their internal, spiritual resources and their shared resolve to survive in an environment that seemed determined to reclaim them. Their story sparks how isolation can be a complex blend of environmental challenges and culling instability. Number 8. The Convent of the White Veil. High in the unforgiving heart of the Austrian Alps, nestled precariously near a perpetual glacier, stood the Convent of the White Veil. Established in the late 12th century by an austere order of Cistercian nuns, this convent was a deliberate choice for extreme asceticism and separation from the world. Its location, thousands of feet above the valley floor, was a testament to a desire for absolute solitude, where the cold, the silence, and the grandeur of the mountains would serve as constant reminders of God's power and humanity's insignificance. The isolation of the Convent of the White Veil was unparalleled. It was surrounded by a chaotic labyrinth of jagged peaks, impassable rock falls, and deep, treacherous ravines. The only approach was a narrow, winding mountain path, little more than a goat track, that was open for only a few months in the height of summer. For the rest of the year, heavy snowfall rendered the path completely impassable, burying it under dozens of feet of snow and ice. Avalanches were a constant threat, thundering down the slopes, sometimes reshaping the very landscape. Records from a local chronicler in Innsbruck, circa 1340, describe the convent's location as a place where the eagle fears to fly, and man is but a fleeting shadow. Life at the Convent of the White Veil was a constant battle against the elements. The sisters were entirely self-sufficient for most of the year. Water was obtained by melting snow and ice, a laborious and time-consuming process. Agriculture was minimal, limited to a few hardy root vegetables grown in sheltered terrace plots during the brief summer. Their diet relied heavily on stored provisions, dried meats, cheeses from their small flock of mountain goats, and precious grains brought up during the short window of access. Cold was a constant permeating presence, demanding vast amounts of firewood and heavy woolen clothing. Frostbite was a common ailment. The daily routine was dictated by the harsh rhythms of the mountain. Prayers for protection from blizzards and rockfalls were as common as petitions for spiritual grace. Communication with the outside world was almost non-existent. A supply caravan might attempt the perilous ascent once a year, carrying essential goods like salt, parchment, or medicinal herbs. Often, these caravans would be turned back by early snows or dangerous conditions, leaving the sisters completely cut off for over 9 months at a time. News from the valley below, if it ever arrived, was months old and irrelevant to their immediate struggle for survival. The sisters lived in a profound silence, broken only by the wind, the creaking of the glacier, or the distant roar of an avalanche. The challenges were numerous and extreme. Beyond the constant threat of hypothermia and frostbite, there was the danger of altitude sickness, which could severely debilitate the sisters. Medical aid was completely unavailable. Injuries or illnesses often proved fatal due to the lack of treatment. The psychological toll of prolonged isolation in such a stark and unforgiving environment was immense. Crushing silence, the relentless cold, and the ever-present danger tested their faith and their sanity. A 13th century letter from a visiting bishop found in the Salzburg archives noted the unwavering spirit and stoic endurance of the sisters, admiring their resilience despite their extreme hardship. Despite these formidable challenges, the Convent of the White Veil endured for centuries, a remarkable testament to human determination and spiritual devotion. It became a legendary place, whispered about by local mountaineers and pilgrims as a place of immense sanctity and unimaginable hardship. The Sisters of the White Veil were not merely isolated. They were immersed in a world of raw, untamed nature, their lives a perpetual act of faith against overwhelming odds. Their story illustrates how a deliberate choice for isolation, driven by spiritual fervor, could lead to a life of extraordinary physical and mental endurance in one of Europe's most extreme environments. Number 9. The Convent of the Windswept Crag. Perched precariously on a desolate, storm-battered island in the far reaches of the Outer Hebrides, off the coast of Scotland, stood the Convent of the Windswept Crag. Established in the early 9th century by a small band of Celtic nuns seeking absolute remoteness from Viking raids and worldly temptations, this convent was a true island within an island, separated from the mainland by ferocious seas and from the meager local population by its sheer inaccessibility. The isolation of the Convent of the Windswept Crag was forged by the relentless power of the North Atlantic. The island itself, a stark, treeless expanse of rock and bog, was constantly lashed by gale force, winds, and torrential rains. Landing was treacherous, with no natural harbor, only a few small rocky coves where a boat might be hauled ashore in calm weather. The journey from the nearest inhabited island, itself remote, could take days by a small currach, and weeks could pass without a single vessel appearing on the horizon. Winter storms could effectively cut off the convent for months, making any kind of sea travel impossible. The very name given to the island in a 10th century monastic charter from Iona, Elian, and F.A. Scheer, or Island of the Watch, speaks to its exposed nature. Life at the Convent of the Windswept Crag was a harsh and unyielding struggle for subsistence. The sisters lived primarily on what the sea provided: fish, shellfish, and the eggs of seabirds, nesting on the cliffs. Their meager gardens, painstakingly cultivated behind low stone walls to offer some protection from the relentless wind, yielded only the hardiest root vegetables and some hardy grains, often stunted and salt-blasted. Fresh water was collected from rainwater cisterns and a few trickling springs, often running low during dry spells. Every necessity from parchment for their scriptures to simple tools had to be brought by boat, a precarious and infrequent event. The daily routine was one of constant vigilance against the elements. The morning bell would often compete with the howl of the wind. Prayers for deliverance from temptation were often joined by fervent pleas for calm seas and safe passage for the rare supply boat. Communication with the outside world was almost non-existent. A message to the Bishop of the Isles might take a year or more to receive a reply, if one ever came. News from the Scottish mainland or beyond arrived months or years later, often distorted or irrelevant to their immediate concerns of survival. The sisters lived in a profound silence, broken only by the roar of the ocean, the cry of gulls, and the incessant wind. The challenges were severe. The relentless storms battered their small stone buildings, requiring constant repair. The biting cold and damp led to chronic ailments like rheumatism and respiratory infections. Medical aid was completely unavailable. Severe injuries or illnesses often proved fatal due to the lack of any proper treatment. The isolation itself, prolonged and absolute, took a psychological toll, fostering a deep communal bond, but also testing individual fortitude. A Norse saga fragment from the 11th century, recounting a rare landing on the island, describes the nuns as pale with eyes like the gray sea, but their spirit burned like a hidden fire. Despite these overwhelming hardships, the Convent of the Windswept Crag endured for centuries, a testament to the extraordinary resilience and unwavering faith of its inhabitants. It became a legendary place among the scattered islanders, a remote beacon of Christian devotion against the raw power of the Atlantic. The sisters of the Windswept Crag were not merely isolated. They were engaged in a perpetual battle with the forces of nature. Their lives a profound act of endurance and spiritual unwaveringness in one of the most remote and challenging environments imaginable. Their story highlights how geographical isolation combined with extreme weather could shape a community into a unique bastion of human perseverance. Number 10. The Convent of the Silent Sentinel. Deep within the sprawling ancient expanse of the Black Forest in what is now southwestern Germany stood the Convent of the Silent Sentinel. Founded in the late 9th century by a group of Benedictine nuns seeking a life of profound seclusion and spiritual devotion, this convent was isolated not by mountains or seas, but by the very nature of the wilderness itself. The Black Forest, at that time, was a vast primeval woodland, largely uncharted and filled with perils both real and imagined. The isolation of the Convent of the Silent Sentinel was defined by its dense, almost impenetrable environment. Reaching it required navigating a labyrinth of unmarked game trails and struggling through thick undergrowth. There were no established roads for miles in any direction, only narrow winding tracks that often disappeared into the forest floor. The forest canopy was so dense that direct sunlight rarely touched the ground, creating an atmosphere of perpetual twilight and a disorienting lack of clear landmarks. Cartographer's note from 1302, preserved in a Strasbourg archive, marks the area around the convent as terra incognita, unknown land, underscoring its profound remoteness. Life at the Convent of the Silent Sentinel was one of self-sufficiency forged in the heart of the wilderness. The sisters relied heavily on foraging for berries, mushrooms, and edible plants, and on the occasional success of hunting small game. They cultivated small, cleared plots of land within the forest, battling encroaching roots and the shade of ancient trees to grow hardy vegetables. Timber from the surrounding forest provided their fuel and building materials, a constant, laborious task. Their diet was largely determined by the seasons and the bounty of the forest, often supplemented by a few hardy domestic animals like pigs or chickens that roamed freely. The daily routine was shaped by the rhythms of the forest. The ringing of the morning bell might be answered by the calls of unseen birds or the rustle of unseen animals. Travel for supplies or to connect with the outside world was a perilous, infrequent undertaking. A supply wagon, if one could be persuaded to make the arduous journey, might attempt to reach them once a year, struggling for days through the dense undergrowth and over uneven terrain. Often, these attempts failed, leaving the sisters to rely entirely on their own stockpiled resources. News from the outside world, if it ever arrived, was months old and filtered through the experiences of brave but often unreliable forest travelers. The sisters lived in a profound silence, broken only by the sounds of the forest and their own spiritual observances. The challenges faced by the Convent of the Silent Sentinel were numerous. The forest was home to wolves, wild boar, and bears, posing a constant threat to their livestock and even themselves. Bandits and outlaws, finding refuge in the deep woods, were also a recurring danger, forcing the sisters to maintain a constant vigil. Getting lost in the vast, disorienting woods was an ever-present risk, and many sisters or even rare visitors simply vanished. Medical aid was non-existent. Illnesses and injuries often proved fatal due to the lack of skilled healers or proper medicines. A record from the nearby Diocese of Speyer, dated 1150, laments the difficulty of maintaining spiritual oversight of the convent, referring to it as a light burning dimly in the vast darkness, a testament to its isolation. Despite these formidable challenges, the Convent of the Silent Sentinel endured for centuries, a remarkable testament to human resilience and unwavering faith. It became a place of legend among the few scattered forest dwellers and woodcutters, a whispered about sanctuary deep within the untamed woods. The Sisters of the Silent Sentinel were not merely isolated. They were immersed in a primeval world, their lives a perpetual act of devotion and survival against the overwhelming forces of nature. Their story highlights how the very wildness of a landscape, rather than its extreme features, could impose an isolation of profound and enduring character.